My world was one of quiet, ordered decay. As a junior archivist at the Blackwood University Library's Special Collections, I spent my days surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten thoughts, the brittle, acid-sweet smell of aging paper, my constant companion. I dealt in the tangible past, handwritten letters from forgotten poets, first editions with cracked leather spines, maps of places that no longer existed. My life was a catalogue of things that were safely, definitively over. I liked it that way. I craved the predictable, the logical, the mundane. Reality, I believed, was something that could be neatly filed and cross-referenced. The first sign that my reality was beginning to tear at the seams was a headache. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the climate-controlled silence of the archives, examining a 17th century manuscript on celestial navigation. A low, high-frequency ringing began in my right ear, the kind you get after a loud concert. Then came the pain. It was a sharp, crystalline spike of agony that drove itself directly through my optic nerve. The meticulously penned Latin on the page before me dissolved into a blinding white light. And in the light I saw symbols. They weren't letters or numbers. They were sharp, geometric, impossible shapes, like shattered snowflakes made of black lightning. They burned in my vision for a timeless second, searing and complex, before vanishing as the pain receded, leaving me gasping, my forehead beaded with a cold sweat. The whole episode lasted less than 5 seconds. I blinked, and the manuscript was back in focus. The world returned to normal. I chalked it up to stress. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. The holy trinity of academic self-diagnosis. I took some aspirin and forgot about it. But it happened again 2 days later. This time as I was locking up my small, quiet apartment. The same high-frequency whine. The same spike of pain. The same fleeting, nightmarish vision of jagged alien geometry. This time, when the migraine passed, it left behind a faint metallic taste at the back of my throat. These episodes became a new, unwelcome part of my routine, occurring every few days with no discernible pattern. They were my own private, painful secret. I tried to explain them away. I told myself it was an undiagnosed neurological condition, something a doctor could name and medicate. It was a comforting thought, but a part of me, a deep instinctual part, knew that what I was seeing was not a symptom. It was a signal. One rainy Friday afternoon, a man visited the archives. This in itself was not unusual, but the man was. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored, dark grey suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the reading room. His face was ageless, his features sharp and placid, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a look of ancient, unnerving patience. He didn't browse or state a field of interest. He walked directly to my desk. I was told I could find an expert in pre-dynastic languages here, he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, but it had a strange resonant quality, as if 2 notes were being spoken at once. Breathe in. I'm more of a preservationist than a linguist, I said, feeling strangely defensive. But I can try to help. What language are you researching? He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that did not reach his pale eyes, one that has no name, one that was spoken not with the tongue, but with the mind, the language of pure concept. I stared at him. It sounded like the nonsensical rambling of a conspiracy theorist or a New Age mystic. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. We deal in documented terrestrial languages here. Of course, he said, his smile never wavering. He wasn't looking at me, but at my wrist, where my hand rested on the desk. A fascinating birthmark, a perfect spiral, so rare. My blood went cold. I instinctively pulled my hand back, my sleeve sliding down to cover the faint spiral-shaped birthmark I'd had my entire life. It was barely visible, a pale tea-stain-colored swirl on my inner wrist that most people never noticed. His gaze, however, had been as direct and intense as if it were a glowing brand. My apologies if I've made you uncomfortable. he said, his eyes finally meeting mine again. The unnerving patience in them was still there. "I'm sure our paths will cross again when the time is right." He gave a slight, formal bow and walked away, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum floor. I sat there for a long time after he left, the silence of the archives pressing in on me. The man's visit had been like a stone dropped into the placid pond of my life, the ripples spreading in ways I couldn't understand. I found myself rubbing the birthmark under my sleeve, suddenly and intensely aware of a part of my own body I had spent my entire life ignoring. That night, the migraine was the worst it had ever been. The pain was so intense it drove me to my knees on my apartment floor. The vision of the symbols was clearer, more complex, and the high-frequency ringing resolved itself into what sounded like a chorus of discordant, whispering voices. I crawled to the bathroom, fumbling in the dark for the bottle of painkillers. As I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles white, I looked up at my own reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. My face was pale, my pupils dilated, and for a horrifying, impossible instant, I saw it. My eyes, normally a plain, muddy hazel, were glowing. It was a faint but undeniable internal luminescence, a soft silver light that seemed to be shining from deep within them. I cried out and stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, then forced them open, staring at my reflection again. They were normal, just my own, familiar, terrified eyes staring back at me. It was a trick of the light, a symptom of the migraine, an optical illusion. I repeated the rationalizations like a mantra, my voice a panicked whisper in the dark room. It had to be. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my armchair, the lights on, until dawn. As the first rays of morning sun streamed through the window, I looked down at my wrist. I don't know why. I just had a sudden terrible compulsion to look. I pushed up my sleeve. The birthmark had changed. It was no longer a faint, tea-stained brown. The lines of the spiral were now a darker, sharper shade, the color of dried blood. It looked less like a mark I was born with and more like a fresh, intricate tattoo. It was a clear, vivid, undeniable symbol, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones that it was one of the geometric shapes that had been burned into my vision. The anomaly was not just in my head anymore. It was on my skin. It was a part of me, the headaches, the visions, the stranger at the library, the glow in my eyes, and now this. They were not separate, random events. They were a sequence, a progression, the beginning of a story I had never asked to be in, written in a language I didn't understand, on the pages of my own body, and I was terrified of what the next chapter would bring. The week following the transformation of my birthmark was a masterclass in denial. I wore long-sleeved shirts, even in the stuffy, climate-controlled archives. I avoided mirrors. I told myself the migraines were a result of eye strain, and the mark on my wrist was a dermatological anomaly, a strange allergic reaction. I constructed a fragile fortress of rationalizations, and for a few days it almost held. My life was about order, about the known. There was no room in my catalogued world for glowing eyes and shifting skin. My boss, Dr. Alistair Finch, was a man who existed in a perpetual cloud of pipe smoke and academic distraction. He was the head of special collections, a brilliant but scattered historian who saw the world through a lens of footnotes and primary sources. It was on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the visit from the man in the grey suit, that Dr. Finch called me into his office. His desk was a chaotic mountain range of books and papers, and from its summit, he produced a long cylindrical tube made of black, reinforced carbon fiber. "Alex," he said, his eyes gleaming with a rare, focused excitement. "A new acquisition, anonymous donor, caused quite a stir with the board. They think it's a forgery, but the carbon dating is inconclusive. I want you on it. Your eye for detail is precisely what this needs." He opened the tube, and carefully slid out its contents onto a velvet cloth. It was a collection of scrolls, or rather the sad, brutalized remnants of them. They were charred at the edges, brittle and fragmented, large sections missing entirely. They looked less like historical documents and more like evidence from an arson investigation. "They're calling them the lacrimal texts," Dr. Finch said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, from the Latin lacrima, for tear, because the scholar who first discovered them in a forgotten monastery in the Pyrenees supposedly went mad and wept until he died of dehydration. I stared at the fragments. The story was absurd, the kind of melodramatic folklore that clings to ancient artifacts. But as I looked closer, a familiar cold dread began to prickle at the base of my skull. The script, it was written in the same sharp, geometric, impossible characters I had been seeing in my migraines. "The language is unknown," Dr. Finch continued, oblivious to my internal crisis. "No connection to any known Proto-Indo-European or Semitic root. It's a complete mystery. The board wants a full report. Composition analysis, script morphology, content assessment. See what you can make of it. Treat it as a puzzle." A puzzle. It felt more like a diagnosis. Taking the fragments back to my workstation felt like carrying my own medical scans. I laid them out carefully, under the soft, non-damaging light of my desk lamp. Up close, the symbols were even more unsettling. They weren't drawn or written with ink. They seemed to be burned into the very fibers of the papyrus, the lines unnaturally sharp and perfect. For the first few days, I treated it as Dr. Finch had suggested, a purely academic exercise. I focused on the material itself, analyzing the weave of the papyrus, the chemical composition of the burn marks. I photographed each fragment, catalogued each symbol, assigning them alphanumeric codes, building a database. I was imposing my own system of order onto the chaos, a desperate attempt to keep the subject at a safe, clinical distance. But the text wouldn't allow it. The more I stared at the symbols, the more they seemed to stare back. The migraines became more frequent, more intense. I'd be in the middle of cataloging a fragment, and the high-frequency ringing would start. The pain would spike, and the symbols on the page would lift, detaching from the papyrus to float, burning and three-dimensional in my vision. They were no longer just images. They felt like concepts, like pure information being downloaded directly into my brain, bypassing language entirely. I started to understand. It wasn't a translation in the traditional sense. I didn't learn a vocabulary or a grammar. The meaning of the symbols simply arrived in my mind during the painful flashes of insight. I began to write down the impressions, the concepts that bloomed in my head after each episode. The words I wrote were English, but they felt like poor, clumsy translations of a language far more profound. The text spoke of a universe born not from a bang, but from a discordant, chaotic scream. It described existence, all of life, all of consciousness, as a temporary, feverish anomaly, a noisy sickness in an otherwise perfect, silent void. And it spoke of a force, a cosmic principle of entropy and quietude it called the Usher. The Usher was not a god or a demon. It was a corrective force, a primordial entity whose sole purpose was to return the universe to its natural, intended state of absolute silence and equilibrium. The prophecy, as I began to piece it together from the shattered fragments, was terrifying. It foretold a time when the Usher would reclaim the world, not through fire or flood, but through a gradual, inexorable silencing. And it would do so through a doorway, a human vessel. For frustrated, the Usher will choose its gate. One of my translated passages read, "A soul born of the noise, yet marked with the sigil of the silence. The vessel will not be a conqueror, but a key. Their voice will not command, but quiet. Their presence will not destroy, but unmake." I worked late into the night, driven by a mixture of academic obsession and a morbid, terrifying need to know. The library would empty out, the main lights would dim, and I would be left alone in the silent archives with the whispering scrolls, and the low hum of the climate control. The silence of the library, once a comfort, now felt charged, expectant. It was close to midnight on a Wednesday when I found the central fragment. It was one of the largest, least damaged pieces, and it seemed to describe the vessel in more detail. I was hunched over my desk, a magnifying lamp illuminating the strange burned characters. A migraine was building behind my eyes, the familiar ringing starting its ascent. The vessel will be known by the mark. The translation bloomed in my mind. A spiral, etched upon their flesh from birth. It is the lock and the key. The focus of the great silence, the point where the world of noise will begin to unravel. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the text, my heart hammering. A spiral, etched upon their flesh from birth. Slowly, as if it belonged to someone else, my left hand rose. My fingers, trembling, pushed up the sleeve of my shirt. I angled my wrist to catch the harsh, direct light of the magnifying lamp. There it was, the birthmark, my birthmark. It was no longer the color of dried blood. It was now a stark, vivid black, as if drawn in fresh ink. Under the intense light of the lamp, it seemed to absorb the illumination, a tiny patch of perfect darkness against my skin. It was a perfect, intricate spiral, and it was an exact one-to-one match for the primary sigil on the scroll in front of me, the symbol the text used to represent the Usher itself. A wave of vertigo washed over me. The room seemed to tilt, the shelves of books swaying like trees in a storm. The high-frequency ringing in my head escalated into a deafening roar. The symbols on the page lifted, swirling around me in the dark, silent room. No longer just images, but a suffocating cloud of pure, malevolent meaning. The prophecy wasn't a historical curiosity. The vessel wasn't a mythical figure from a forgotten religion. It was me. I shoved myself away from the desk, my chair flying backwards and crashing into a bookshelf. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling, my hand clamped over my wrist as if I could hide the mark, as if I could push it back into my skin. I ran from the archives, a choked, panicked sob escaping my lips. I didn't stop running until I was outside in the cold, damp night air, my lungs burning, the ordinary sounds of a distant siren and passing cars a welcome, grounding reality. But even as I stood there, trembling under the familiar, comforting glow of a street lamp, I knew it was too late. The quiet, ordered world I had built for myself was gone. The puzzle wasn't on the page anymore. It was in my blood and on my skin. I was the text, and I was beginning to understand every terrible word. For a week, I lived the life of a fugitive. My own body, the scene of the crime. I called in sick to the university, claiming a sudden vicious flu. The lacrymal text, the source of my personal apocalypse, lay abandoned on my workstation in the silent archives. I spent my days in my small apartment, a prisoner of my own escalating dread. I tried to force normalcy back into my life through sheer stubborn routine. I made coffee, I read novels, I watched mindless television. I did everything I could to convince myself that I was still Alex, the quiet archivist, and not the subject of a terrifying cosmic prophecy. It was a losing battle. The spiral on my wrist was a constant, damning reminder. I tried covering it with a watch, with a wristband, but it was like trying to hide a fire by putting a lampshade over it. I could feel its presence, a strange, cold spot on my skin, a focal point for the wrongness that was now infesting my life. The physical symptoms, the ones I had once dismissed as stress, now intensified, becoming impossible to ignore. The cold sweats came without warning, drenching my clothes in the middle of a warm room, leaving me shivering and clammy. And then there were the tremors. My hands, once the steady instruments of my delicate profession, became unreliable traitors. I'd be lifting a coffee cup to my lips, and a violent, uncontrollable shaking would seize my arm, sending hot liquid sloshing over the sides. I dropped plates. I could barely sign my own name on a grocery receipt. My body was staging a quiet, relentless rebellion against my own control. But the eyes were the worst. The glowing had moved beyond a split-second, migraine-induced illusion. It was becoming a feature. One evening, walking home after a necessary trip for groceries, I caught my reflection in the dark plate glass window of a closed cafe. I stopped dead, my shopping bag slipping from my trembling fingers. The man in the reflection was me, but his eyes were not. They were glowing with a soft, steady, internal silver light. It was not a reflection of a street lamp. It was a luminescence coming from within, like the deep-sea bioluminescence of a creature that lives its entire life in the dark. I stood there for nearly 10 seconds, mesmerized and horrified, before the light faded, leaving only my own wide, terrified eyes staring back from the darkness. The silence, as the text called it, was also growing stronger. It was no longer just a brief, personal ringing in my ears. It was beginning to bleed out into the world around me. After a week of self-imposed exile, I forced myself to go back to work. I couldn't hide forever. I needed the structure, the familiarity of the archives. I was in the main reading room of the library, reshelving a cart of returned books, the familiar, comforting sounds of a university library around me, the soft rustle of turning pages, the distant hum of the ventilation, the quiet scholarly coughs. Then, the silence descended. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was instantaneous. One moment, the room was full of sound. The next, it was a perfect vacuum-sealed void. The air pressure changed, my ears popping painfully. A young woman a few tables away from me dropped a heavy-looking textbook. I saw it hit the polished wooden floor. I saw the impact, but there was no sound, no thud, nothing. She stared at the book, her face a mask of utter confusion. I looked around the room. Everyone was frozen. Students were looking up from their laptops, their mouths slightly agape. A professor paused mid-sentence, his hand touching his ear. They were all trapped in the bubble of my personal apocalypse. My trembling hands failed me. The book I was holding, a heavy tome on medieval history, slipped from my grasp. I watched it fall in slow motion. It hit the floor with a silent, jarring impact that I felt in the soles of my feet but did not hear. The sound was simply deleted, and I knew, with a certainty so absolute it felt like a physical blow, that I was the cause. I was the epicenter. This dead zone of absolute quiet was emanating from me. After a full, agonizing minute that stretched for an eternity, the sound rushed back in, a sudden jarring cacophony. The professor finished his sentence. The students all shook their heads, looking around, a low murmur of confusion filling the room. The young woman who had dropped her book now heard the thud it should have made a minute ago, and she jumped, startled. To them, it was a bizarre, inexplicable moment of shared sensory weirdness. To me, it was a terrifying demonstration. The power was growing, and it was affecting others. I fled, leaving the cart of books where it stood, my heart pounding with a new kind of fear, the fear of what I could do to the innocent people around me, the listeners. The silent watchers of my cursed ascension also escalated their efforts. They were no longer content to observe from a distance. Their gifts became more direct, more alarming. One morning, I opened my apartment door to find a package on my doormat. It was a long, narrow box, wrapped in simple black cloth. Inside, resting on a bed of silk, was a knife. It was an impossibly ancient-looking ritual dagger, its blade carved from a single piece of glistening black obsidian, its hilt wrapped in faded leather. It was another artifact I recognized from my frantic translations of the texts, the Blade of Unmaking, a tool used in ceremonies to carve the silence. It was not a threat, it was an offering, a piece of my ceremonial regalia. Their physical presence became a form of psychological torture. I would see them everywhere. The man in the grey suit, standing across the street from my apartment building at 3 o'clock in the morning, his pale eyes fixed on my window. A woman with a placid, unreadable face, sitting in the back of the coffee shop, stirring a drink she never drank. A young man who would follow me at a discreet distance through the campus, his hands in his pockets, his gaze never wavering. They never approached. They never spoke. They just watched. Their silent, reverent surveillance a constant, screaming reminder that my life was no longer my own. My nights offered no escape. Sleep was a journey into the heart of the anomaly. I no longer had simple nightmares. I had visions. I would find myself floating in a silent, starless void, a profound and peaceful emptiness that should have been terrifying, but felt strangely like coming home. The black geometric symbols from the texts would swirl around me, not as threats, but as a familiar alphabet, their meaning resonating deep within my being. I would wake up in the dead of night, my room freezing cold, the windows etched with intricate, feathery patterns of frost, even though it was a mild autumn outside. And the mark on my wrist, it was changing again. It was no longer just a black, inert symbol. It was physically cold to the touch, as if it were a piece of metal embedded in my skin, and in the dark, it began to glow. A faint, cold, silver light, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the hum in my ears. One night, unable to sleep, I stood in my darkened bathroom, staring at my own reflection. I didn't need to wait for a glitch or a trick of the light. My eyes were glowing steadily now, two soft, silver orbs in the darkness. The hum was a constant, low thrum in my skull. I held up my wrist, and the spiral mark pulsed with its own cold light. A third, malevolent star in the constellation of my own damnation. I was no longer a man experiencing strange symptoms. The symptoms were coalescing, integrating, becoming a part of me. The vessel was being filled. The key was being forged. The door was being unlocked. I stared at the strange, luminous creature in the mirror, the creature that wore my face, and I understood. The awakening wasn't something that was going to happen. It was happening now, and I had no idea how to stop it. My apartment became a fortress, and I was both its prisoner and its dragon. For 3 days, I didn't leave. I unplugged the television, the computer, the radio, anything that could produce a signal, a sound, a connection to the outside world. I drew the blinds, living in a perpetual state of twilight, avoiding any reflective surface that might show me the silver-eyed stranger I was becoming. My strategy was simple, born of a desperate primal logic. If the power fed on stimuli, on the noise of the world, then I would starve it. I would become an island of silence and hope the tide of this madness would recede. But the world has a way of refusing to be ignored. By the third night, my cupboards were bare. Hunger, a simple, mundane, biological imperative, forced my hand. I had to go out. The thought of stepping outside, of immersing myself in the chaotic, noisy sea of the city, filled me with a terror so profound it was paralyzing. It felt like walking into a minefield, with every synapse in my brain a potential trigger. I waited until well after midnight, hoping the streets would be quiet, the city asleep. I pulled on a hooded sweatshirt, the hood drawn low to shadow my face, and slipped out into the night. The air was cool and damp. The sounds of the city, which I had once found so anonymous and comforting, were now a physical assault. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a late-night bus, the hum of the streetlights. Each sound was a spark, threatening to ignite the volatile, silent power coiled inside me. The low, familiar hum in my own ears seemed to harmonize with the city's energy, growing stronger, more insistent. I walked with my shoulders hunched, my hands jammed in my pockets, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to leave no psychic footprint on the world. My destination was an all-night convenience store, a small fluorescent lit box of reliable mediocrity. I just needed bread, milk, something to get me through another few days of hiding. To get there, I had to pass through a series of narrow, winding streets, a relic of the city's older colonial layout. To avoid a group of loud students spilling out of a bar, I made a decision I would instantly regret. I took a shortcut down a narrow, unlit service alley that ran behind a row of restaurants. The air in the alley was thick with the smell of stale beer and cooking grease. It was a dark, grimy canyon of brick and dumpsters. I was halfway through when a figure detached itself from the shadows near a dumpster, blocking my path. He was thin and wiry, his movements twitchy, with a desperate energy. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on me with a predator's focus. He held a small, grimy pocket knife, its blade catching a faint gleam from the distant street lamp. A mugger, a simple garden variety, real-world monster. In any other time in my life, I would have been terrified, but my capacity for normal fear had been hollowed out, replaced by the far grander, cosmic terror of my own condition. My first thought was not for my wallet, but a desperate, frantic prayer. Please, not now. Don't make me feel anything. Wallet. Phone. Now, he rasped, his voice a gravelly mix of aggression and desperation. He took a step closer, the knife held low. Don't be a hero. I raised my hands slowly, a gesture of universal surrender. Okay, take it easy, I said, my voice trembling. But it was too late. The sudden sharp spike of adrenaline, the primal fight or flight fear, was a match thrown on gasoline. The power inside me, the Usher's silent, hungry gift, responded not to my will, but to my terror. The silence descended. It was not like the gentle hushing in the library. This was a violent, concussive implosion of sound. The mugger's next threat was cut off mid-word. The distant siren, the hum of the restaurant's ventilation fans, the scuttling of a rat behind the dumpster, all of it was instantly, brutally deleted from existence. The world was plunged into a perfect, pressurized void. The air in the alley shimmered, the grimy brick walls seeming to warp and stretch as if made of rubber. The single, bare bulb over a back door at the far end of the alley flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging us into a deeper darkness. The mugger froze, his head snapping up, his eyes darting around the now silent alley. His face, which had been a mask of predatory confidence, collapsed into utter confusion. He could see my mouth moving, but he couldn't hear my panicked breathing. He could see his own feet scuffing the pavement, but the sound of gravel under his boots was gone. His confusion curdled into a primal terror that was a mirror of my own. He started shouting, his face contorting, his throat working, but his screams were stillborn, sucked into the soundless void. He clawed at his ears, as if trying to dig out the silence. His eyes, wide and crazed, locked onto mine. I don't know what he saw there, the silver glow, the reflection of his own silent terror, but his sanity broke. With a final, soundless shriek that I felt as a vibration through the ground, his eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the pavement like a puppet with its strings cut, his body convulsing once before lying still. He was not dead. He was disconnected. His mind, unable to process the absolute sensory deprivation, had simply shut down. As my own fear began to subside, so did the manifestation. With a gut-wrenching lurch and a sound like air rushing back into a vacuum, the sound of the world returned, unnaturally loud and sharp. The dead bulb over the door flickered back to life. I was left standing in a normal, noisy city alley, the body of my would-be attacker at my feet, my own harsh, ragged gasps the loudest sound in the world. I stared down at the man, horrified. My hands, my fear, my very existence had done this. I was a weapon, and I didn't know how to disarm myself. The power is a shield. It protects its vessel. The voice was soft, calm, and came from the shadows behind me. I spun around, my heart seizing. A figure emerged from the alley's mouth, stepping into the dim light. It was one of them, a listener, not the man in the suit, but a younger woman, her face serene, dressed in the simple, dark, functional clothing I had come to recognize. She showed no fear of me, no surprise at the scene. She walked past me and knelt beside the unconscious mugger, placing 2 delicate fingers on his neck to check his pulse. Her movements were calm, practiced, but it is untamed, she continued, looking up at me, her eyes holding not judgment, but a look of profound, almost pitying reverence. The vessel is not yet ready to focus the gift. The silence should be a gentle wave, not a shattering blow. I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, my mind reeling. Frustrated, "Do not be alarmed," she said, her voice a soothing balm that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. She looked back down at the mugger. "We will attend to this discordant noise." Her words chilled me to the bone. She wasn't offering to call an ambulance. She wasn't offering compassion. She was offering to clean up my mess, to hide the evidence, to erase the collateral damage of my awakening, ensuring that nothing would interfere with the prophecy. I didn't wait to see what that entailed. I turned and fled, my feet pounding on the pavement, leaving the listener, the broken man, and a large part of my own humanity behind in that dark, silent alley. I ran all the way back to my apartment, locking and bolting the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the door, and finally let the sobs come, great, racking waves of horror and self-loathing. The listeners were not just watchers. They were not just followers. They were facilitators. They were the quiet, efficient stagehands in the grand cosmic theater of my damnation, ready to sweep the stage of any inconvenient bodies and ensure the final act proceeded on schedule. I looked at my hands in the dim light of my apartment. They had once catalogued history. Now, they had created a terrifying new chapter of it. My life as Alex, the archivist, was over. That person had died in the alley tonight. The life of the vessel, the unwilling harbinger of the great silence, had truly, irrevocably begun. The man in the alley was a ghost that haunted my waking hours more than any vision from the texts. I had crossed a line, a terrible and irrevocable threshold. The power inside me was no longer a passive internal anomaly. It was an active external force, a weapon that reacted to my own fear with devastating consequences. I spent the next 2 days in a state of heightened paranoid vigilance, my apartment a self-imposed prison cell. I ate little, I slept less. My every waking moment was consumed by the terrifying new knowledge of what I was capable of. Hiding was a temporary solution, a futile one. The listeners knew where I lived. The woman from the alley had proven they were not just observers, but active participants, janitors of the apocalypse who would quietly sweep my messes under the rug. They were waiting, but for what? For me to have another panic attack and level a city block with a wave of absolute silence. For the power to grow so strong, it consumed me completely. The fear of what I might do to someone else became greater than my fear of them. I couldn't stay locked away forever, and I couldn't walk the streets as a living, ticking time bomb. Hiding was cowardice. Running was impossible. My only remaining option was to confront them, to face the architects of my slow, horrifying transformation, and demand an answer. My decision led me back to the one place that connected us all, the source of my curse, the Blackwood University Library archives. I went late at night, long after the last student had left, and the heavy oak doors were locked to the world. My old staff key still worked. Letting myself into the vast, dark and silent library felt like a transgression, a breaking of my old life's rules. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the familiar, comforting scent of old paper and binding glue. But the comfort was gone. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt expectant. It felt like theirs. I didn't turn on the main lights. I navigated by the faint, green glow of the emergency exit signs, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. I made my way to the Special Collections wing, to my archives, the heart of my former life. As I pushed open the heavy door, I knew I was not alone. They were waiting for me, just as I had known they would be. They stood arranged in a silent, solemn semicircle in the center of the main reading room. In the middle was the man in the impeccably tailored grey suit, his pale eyes catching the green emergency light. On his right was the woman from the alley, her face as serene and unreadable as ever. They were flanked by 3 others, all dressed in simple, dark, functional clothing. Their faces calm, their hands clasped before them. They were not here for a fight. This was a parley or an ordination. "We have been expecting you, Alex," the man in the suit said. His voice was the same smooth, resonant baritone, but in the echoing silence of the archives, it held the weight of a sermon. "It is good that you have come. It means you are beginning to understand that you cannot run from your own nature." "What have you done to me?" I asked, my voice a harsh, raw whisper that felt like a sacrilege in the hallowed quiet. "We have done nothing," he replied, a hint of something like pity in his tone. "We are merely the chroniclers, the watchers who have tended the lighthouse for millennia, waiting for the chosen ship to finally see its beam. You were born with the mark. You were chosen before time had a name." He gestured to the silent figures beside him. "We are the children of the great silence, the listeners, and you, Alex, are the vessel." He spoke the words from the prophecy. My prophecy, and hearing them said aloud in this place sent a tremor of cold dread through me. "What do you want?" I demanded, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "We want to help you," he said simply. "The awakening you are experiencing is a painful, chaotic process. A birth is never without struggle. The power of the Usher is a force of cosmic correction, and your human form is a fragile container for it. You lash out in fear because you do not understand the gift you have been given." "A gift?" I choked out a laugh that was more like a sob. "I almost killed a man. I'm a walking disaster." I turn rooms silent. My eyes glow in the dark. "That's not a gift. It's a curse. It's a disease." "Disease is the natural state of this universe," the proctor said, his voice taking on a professorial, lecturing tone. He gestured to the millions of books surrounding us, to the repository of all human history, art, and science. "All of this, it is nothing more than the frantic, chaotic shrieking of a temporary cosmic anomaly. Life, consciousness. You call it beautiful. We know it for what it is. A discordant noise in the perfect, eternal symphony of the void. A fever that must eventually break." His words were calm, rational, and utterly, horrifyingly insane. He was delivering a nihilistic sermon, a philosophy of universal extinction. "The great silence is not an end," he continued, his pale eyes seeming to glow with a fanatical light. "It is a purification, a return to the serene, perfect equilibrium that existed before the sickness of existence. It is a mercy. The Usher does not destroy. It heals, it quiets the noise, it brings peace. The peace of the grave," I whispered, horrified. "The grave is a noisy, messy, biological process." He corrected me gently. "The silence is perfect. It is the state to which all things yearn to return." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "Your role in this vessel is not to be a king or a conqueror. You are the doorway, the conduit. Your human form, marked from birth, is the anchor point that allows the Usher to manifest in this plane of existence. Through you, the great silence will flood the world and correct the error of creation." He stopped in front of me. I could feel a strange, cold energy emanating from him. "The awakening is accelerating. You cannot stop it. Trying to suppress it will only cause more uncontrolled, destructive outbursts, like the one in the alley. You will hurt more people. You will break the minds of those you touch with your fear. But it does not have to be that way." This was it. The invitation. Frustrated. "We can teach you," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate, persuasive whisper. "We have the knowledge, preserved for generations, passed down from the last time a vessel walked the earth. We can show you how to control the power, to focus it, to become its master, not its victim. We can make the transition a gentle, peaceful one, a slow, quiet sunset, instead of a violent, chaotic storm." The end will be the same. The prophecy is inevitable, but the path to it can be one of grace. I stared at him, at his calm, reasonable face, at the serene, worshipful expressions of his followers. They were offering me a partnership in the end of the world. They wanted me to be a willing participant in the erasure of everything. I thought of the noisy, chaotic, beautiful world outside these walls, of street musicians and laughing children, of arguments in coffee shops and the roar of a crowd at a concert. All the things they called a disease, I called life. Frustrated. "You're insane," I said, my voice shaking with a rage that finally eclipsed my fear. "All of you. That's not peace. It's nothingness. It's the end of everything that has ever mattered. I want no part of it. I will not be your messiah. I will not be your fucking door." My rejection hung in the silent, charged air of the archives. I expected anger, threats, a fight. Instead, the proctor's expression softened into one of genuine, profound pity. He looked at me the way a doctor might look at a terminally ill patient who refuses to accept their diagnosis. "Oh, vessel," he said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that seemed ancient. "The choice was never whether the door would open, only whether you would walk through it or be dragged." With that, he and the other listeners took a step back. They did not walk away. They simply receded into the deep shadows between the towering bookshelves, their forms dissolving into the darkness as if they had never been there at all. I was alone again. In the heart of the silent library, the weight of my decision, of my defiance, settled upon me. I had refused the help of the only people in the world who understood the monster I was becoming. I had chosen to fight, but you cannot fight a tide. You can only tread water for so long before it pulls you under. I had refused their invitation, but the party was still happening, and I was the guest of honor. The listener's departure left a vacuum in the archives, a silence heavier and more final than any the Usher could produce. They had offered me a gilded cage, a way to be a more comfortable and compliant instrument of the apocalypse, and I had refused. My defiance felt hollow, a child's tantrum in the face of an oncoming tidal wave. I was alone, caught in a cosmic crossfire, a heretic to the only church that understood my condition. My first instinct, the archivist's instinct, was to return to the source. For the next few days, I lived in the library, fueled by black coffee and a desperate, frantic hope. I plunged back into the scorched, cryptic fragments of the lacrimal texts. But my goal had changed. I was no longer a simple translator. I was a desperate prisoner, scouring my own death sentence for a loophole, a stay of execution. I searched for a counter-ritual, a forgotten word, a missing passage that might speak of a way to sever the connection, to close the door I had been born to open. The texts offered no such comfort. They spoke only of the inevitability of the vessel's purpose. Every symbol, every translated concept, reinforced the listener's cold philosophy. The more I read, the more I understood that the texts were not a warning, they were an instruction manual, and my own body was the malfunctioning device it described. My attempts to understand and suppress the power only seemed to anger it. It was like trying to contain a supernova in a glass jar. The pressure built, and the cracks in my reality began to widen into chasms. The physical changes were no longer subtle or intermittent. They were becoming a permanent part of my biology. The silver glow in my eyes, once a fleeting, ghostly flicker, became a constant, low-level luminescence. In the dim light of the archives, my eyes shone with a soft, steady internal light. I started wearing dark sunglasses, even indoors, a pathetic attempt to hide the fact that I was becoming something other than human. The spiral on my wrist was now a constant, cool presence. It no longer needed darkness to be seen. It glowed with a faint but persistent silver light, a beacon broadcasting my cursed nature to the world. At night, I would lie awake and watch it pulse in a slow, steady rhythm, a second, alien heartbeat in the quiet of my room. My life became a series of controlled, paranoid movements. I avoided people, took my meals at odd hours, and spoke only when absolutely necessary, terrified that any strong emotion would trigger another uncontrolled manifestation. But the power was no longer waiting for a trigger. It was beginning to act on its own. The silence, once a brief, shocking event, was starting to settle around me like a permanent atmosphere. When I was alone in my apartment, the normal ambient sounds of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the water pipes, the distant traffic would simply fade away, leaving me in a perfect sterile void for an hour at a time. I was becoming my own walking, localized reality failure. The cascade, when it finally happened, was not in a dark alley or a silent room. It happened in the brightest, loudest place I could have chosen. A testament to the power's cruel sense of irony, I had been forced to return to the university campus to meet with Dr. Finch. To explain my prolonged absence, I had concocted a flimsy story about a family emergency as I was walking across the central quad at noon. The day was bright and loud and painfully, vibrantly alive. Hundreds of students were spread across the green, talking, laughing, listening to music on their phones. The central fountain splashed merrily. The air was a thick, chaotic symphony of human noise, and I was walking directly through the middle of it. I felt the power respond to the overwhelming sensory input. The hum in my skull, which had become a constant companion, began to escalate in pitch and intensity. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me. I felt the familiar, terrifying pressure building behind my eyes. I knew what was about to happen. I tried to fight it, to clench my mental fists and hold it back. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with a sandcastle. The silence erupted from me. It was not a bubble this time. It was a wave. A visible, shimmering distortion that expanded outwards from my body with breathtaking speed. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. One moment, the quad was a roaring chorus of life. The next, it was a silent film. A young man with a frisbee in his hand, his mouth open in a shout to his friend, was frozen in a posture of silent, pointless urgency. A group of students laughing at a table all froze, their smiles turning to masks of confusion. The fountain's splashing water continued to arc through the air, but it fell into the basin with no sound. A professor on the steps of the library, delivering an impassioned mobile phone call, continued to gesture wildly, his mouth forming words that were simply deleted from the air. The wave expanded, washing over the entire quad in seconds. Laptops, tablets, and phones in its path went dark, their screens winking out as if their batteries had been instantly removed. A university security cart that was zipping past the fountain rolled to a silent, dead stop, its electric motor instantly neutralized. The Usher's power was not merely the absence of sound, it was the absence of energy, of complexity, of the very noise of existence. For a full 2 minutes, the scene was one of profound, collective, silent panic. People looked around, their faces a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. They touched their ears. They shouted at each other, their silent mouths forming desperate, useless words. They were all characters in a play, whose audio had been cut, trapped in a shared, inexplicable nightmare, and I was its silent, horrified author. Then, as abruptly as it began, the silence receded. Sound rushed back in, a deafening, chaotic wave. Everyone in the quad cried out at once, a collective gasp of shock and relief. The security cart's motor whirred back to life. Phones began to reboot. The fountain's splash was once again audible. But the world had been broken and put back together again, and everyone knew it. The event, which would later be dubbed the campus hush by a breathless media, was too large, too public to be dismissed. It was a shared, undeniable miracle, or an act of terrifying, incomprehensible power. In the ensuing chaos, I fled, pulling the hood of my sweatshirt low, my face pale. As I reached the edge of the quad, I looked back and I saw him. The proctor, the man in the grey suit. He was standing near the library steps, observing the panicked crowd. He was not affected. He turned, and his pale, knowing eyes met mine from across the chaos. He wasn't angry. His expression was one of serene, almost proud vindication. "See," his gaze seemed to say, "see what happens when you resist." My life was over. Within hours, my face, captured on a dozen security cameras and 100 smartphones, was being broadcast on the news. I was no longer Alex, the archivist. I was the epicenter of the acoustic anomaly. A person of interest, a potential terrorist, a freak. I was a pariah to the very world I had, in my own way, tried to protect. That night, I was in a cheap, anonymous motel room, 30 miles outside the city. The television was on, a news anchor talking about me, a grainy security still of my terrified face on the screen behind her. I looked at my own reflection in the dark TV screen. My eyes were no longer a soft, intermittent glow. They were two steady, brilliant silver orbs. The spiral on my wrist was a vivid, pulsing sigil, its light bright enough to read by. I was a monster, a harbinger. The listeners had been right. The awakening could not be stopped. I had nowhere left to run, no life to return to. All I had left was the terrible, unstoppable power that was cascading out of me. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the obsidian knife they had left for me, that this was only the beginning. The motel room was a cage of buzzing fluorescent lights and the stale smell of bleach. On the television, a grainy security image of my face was plastered next to the words, "Acoustic anomaly." I was a phenomenon, a headline, a ghost haunting the 24-hour news cycle. To the world, I was a threat, a mystery to be solved and contained. To myself, I was a failure, a man who had tried to outrun a prophecy and had only succeeded in becoming its lead story. The awakening was no longer a process. It was a state of being. The power had settled deep into my bones, a permanent resident in the house of my body. My eyes were a constant, low-level silver glow, a feature I now had to hide behind a pair of cheap sunglasses, even at night. The spiral on my wrist was a brilliant pulsing sigil of cold silver light that I kept wrapped in bandages. But these were cosmetic fixes for a problem that was now fundamentally a part of my existence. The true problem was the silence. It was no longer a temporary event I could trigger. It was my atmosphere, a permanent, ever-expanding dead zone of sound and energy surrounded me. The buzzing of the motel's ice machine in the hallway would die the moment I opened my door. The streetlights outside my window would flicker and extinguish as I passed. My presence was becoming a blight, a walking, talking patch of cosmic entropy. I knew I couldn't keep running. Hiding in the noisy, chaotic world of humanity was like hiding a lit match in a fireworks factory. My very presence was the danger. Every person I passed on the street was at risk from an uncontrolled surge. Every electronic device I came near was a potential casualty. My desperate attempt to preserve the world I loved was actively endangering it. In the profound, lonely silence of that motel room, a terrible, clarifying thought bloomed in my mind. The listeners, in their own fanatical, monstrous way, had been right. The power could not be stopped. It could not be contained. My struggle was the source of the chaos. My fear was the fuel for the destructive, uncontrolled outbursts. There was only one path left, not of fighting, not of running, but of acceptance, of surrender. The lacrimal texts, which I had stolen from the archives in my flight, spoke of a final destination, a place where the veil between worlds was thinnest, where the Usher's power could be focused, a place they called the Silent Heart. My research had identified it as a vast, desolate salt flat in a remote corner of Utah, a place of natural, profound quiet. The prophecy said the vessel must go there to complete the transition. I had thought it was a place of sacrifice. I now understood it was a place of coronation. My final journey was a pilgrimage of defeat. I traveled by night, stealing cars and abandoning them, a ghost moving across the sleeping landscape of America. The listeners did not follow. They did not need to. They knew where I was going. They were not my hunters anymore. They were my silent, patient, welcoming committee. I arrived at the salt flats at dawn. The landscape was a perfect, blindingly white expanse under a pale, enormous sky. The silence here was natural, profound, and absolute. It was the perfect canvas for the great silence to be painted upon. They were there, waiting for me in the center of the vast plain. The proctor, in his grey suit, stood beside the woman from the alley and a dozen other robed figures. They were arranged in a circle, and their faces held no triumph, only a deep, solemn reverence. This was not a capture, it was a homecoming. I walked towards them, my steps the only sound for 100 miles. I stopped before the proctor. My sunglasses were long gone, and my silver eyes met his pale, patient ones. I unraveled the bandage from my wrist, revealing the pulsing silver spiral. It glowed with a fierce, steady light in the dawn. Frustrated, "You have come," the proctor said. It was not a question. There was nowhere else to go, I replied, my voice hoarse. "There never was," he said gently. "It is time, vessel. It is time to quiet the noise. It is time to heal the world." He produced the obsidian knife, the blade of unmaking. He held it not as a weapon, but as a sacrament. He took my hand, his touch surprisingly warm. He used the tip of the ancient volcanic glass to gently, reverently, trace the glowing spiral on my wrist. It didn't cut my skin, but I felt the touch on a level deeper than flesh. It was a key turning in the final lock, a circuit being completed. I had spent months fighting the power, fearing it, suppressing it. Now, for the first time, I let go. I didn't push it away. I welcomed it. I accepted it. The sensation was not one of pain or loss. It was one of peace. A profound, absolute peace that was beyond all human understanding. The frantic, terrified voice of Alex, the archivist, the man who loved books and quiet mornings, finally went silent. My own personal noise was the first to be quieted. The hum in my skull ceased. My consciousness, my memories, my very sense of self dissolved, merging with the vast, cool and silent intelligence of the Usher. I was no longer a man. I was a function. I was no longer a key. I was the open door. A visible, shimmering wave of pure silence emanated from my body. It was not a wave of destruction, but of perfect, peaceful negation. It expanded outwards, calm, absolute, and unstoppable. The listeners, still on their knees, were the first to be touched by it. I watched them from my new, boundless perspective. Their faces were alight with ecstatic, transcendent joy. They had waited their entire lives for this moment of holy purification. As the wave washed over them, they did not scream, they did not die, they were simply unmade. Their forms dissolved into the silent, shimmering peace, their discordant life energy returning to the perfect, serene equilibrium of the void. The wave continued to expand. The wind stopped. The dust motes in the air ceased their dance. The sunlight itself seemed to dim, its chaotic, energetic photons calming, its warmth bleeding away into a cool silver twilight. The very vibration of matter, the low, constant hum of existence itself, was being soothed, silenced, put to sleep. My last thought, the final, fading echo of the man named Alex, was one of terrible, final clarity. The prophecy was never a curse. It wasn't a gift. It was a law of physics, as inevitable and as impersonal as gravity. My life, my struggles, my brief and noisy flicker of consciousness had been nothing more than the friction of that law reasserting itself. From my new perspective, I could see the wave washing over the desolate landscape, silencing the scrub brush and the rocks. I could see it reach the distant highway, the cars rolling to a silent, gentle stop. I could see it approaching the first sleeping towns on the horizon. My vision expanded. I saw the continent. I saw the curve of the earth, a frantic, beautiful blue and white marble of chaotic temporary noise. And I saw the silent, silver wave that was me, expanding, ever expanding, to finally, mercifully quiet it all.